12 years ago, I started my career as a professor. And my very first job, I was hired in 1994 by Georgetown University to replace a guy named Abby Williams, a native of Sierra Leone, who had decided to leave the academic world and join a UN peacekeeping force in the former Yugoslavia. Now, when Abby left Georgetown, I took over his office and his responsibilities. He had just started a program on power and justice, and I was asked if I would direct it since he had left. I agreed to do this. Well, it was pretty clear what we were going to focus on in 1994, human rights and genocide. And as my students learned about what was unfolding, what had happened in Rwanda and in Bosnia, they were shocked. They said to me, how is it that the world made such bold commitments after World War II, such big promises, and yet it has not acted adequately in the face of genocide 50 years later? Some of my students came to the conclusion during that year that the world was a violent place, it was an unfair place, it was an unchangeable place. The best you could hope for: protect yourself, protect your interests, drown out the noise. But a lot of my students followed me around campus. They came to my office. They were itching to do something. I want to go to Africa. I want to make a difference. But am I crazy? Can what I do matter? My students then, my students today face the dilemma all of us face. Why should we care? Why should we try to lead moral lives? Why should we do anything for the plight of desperate people thousands of miles away? I tried to tell my students why. I said to them, you know, if you look at human history, the people who stand out, the people who made it, were the people who stood up for what is right. And we owe them a great debt. The freedom that we have, the opportunities that we have, the dignity that we enjoy, is largely the result of acts of great courage and moral fortitude by people who will never know us. And I said, today, there are people who depend, and in the future there will be people born who depend on what we do, on how courageous we decide to be, on how we decide to use our time. We're part of something bigger than ourselves. And as informed and privileged individuals, we have opportunities and capabilities that even our governments don't have, and we need to take advantage of those. Now at Georgetown, just as here at UCI, I tried to bring in people who in the face of great odds had acted courageously, had stood up for what was right. And over the years, I've come to the conclusion that these people are a lot like ourselves. They get tired. They have doubts. They make mistakes. They despair. And I think this is the reason why listening to their stories is so inspiring. It's reassuring because it reminds us that every one of us inside has the capacity to do what's right. Just as I imagine every one of us has the capacity to do evil or to do nothing. Over the years, because of my position, my job, I've traveled and seen some of the most violent and unhappy places on the planet, in Africa and Asia, in the Middle East. I've visited refugee camps. I've met many landmine survivors, child soldiers. And believe me, I know the world's problems are big and they're complicated. You only have to scan today's headlines. 655,000 extra civilian deaths in Iraq, mounting violence in Sri Lanka. It doesn't take much to appreciate that the problems we face are big and complicated. But my experience has convinced me that what we do matters. It matters very directly to people who are in need. I cannot tell you how many times people have said to me, the fact that you're here helps us. Just the fact that you're here gives us hope. And meeting people in conditions so abject I cannot even begin to describe them. I've started to understand not only the enormous gulf that separates us, because there is a great distance between Orange County and Darfur, but also what it is that we have in common. We are human together. Now, in the grand scheme of things, my actions and the actions of my students, they're just a small gesture towards the betterment of humankind. I suppose that nothing any of us can do can ever be enough, but I strongly believe that what we do matters. It's of immeasurable importance. I don't know how familiar you in this audience are with Senator and General Romeo Dallaire. I encourage you to read his biography. It's a fascinating book. Shake Hands with the Devil, or watch the documentary or the upcoming feature film of the same title. In 1993, he traveled to Rwanda as UN Force Commander to oversee the implementation of the Arusha Peace Accord, and in his own words, it was expected to be a sort of easy mission. But very quickly, he realized that the accord was collapsing and the mission was changing character. He realized that Rwanda was on the threshold of genocide. Now, General Dallaire knew that international law authorizes us to act to prevent genocide. He also knew that the small, under-resourced peacekeeping force he led could not turn the tide, but with an injection of just a couple thousand well-trained soldiers, he could back down the instigators, and he could seize control of the situation. And military analysts have looked over his recommendations, and they've agreed. They've even put a price tag on it, $100 million, what we spend in a single day in Iraq. General Dallaire was not naive. He knew that his peacekeeping mission was embedded in this large multinational bureaucracy, the United Nations, and it wasn't set up for quick and decisive action. But the need was so clear and the opportunity was so immediate. One can only imagine the frustration that he experienced, and one can only marvel at the leadership and the ingenuity that he demonstrated as he pursued one channel after another to try and convince the world that the time to act was now, to make his case. And the world denied him, including our own President Clinton. In spite of that, he stayed on, and his troops stayed on, and they saved thousands of lives. And since that time, at some cost to his own well-being, his own privacy as an individual, he has traveled around the world, bearing witness to what happened, sharing his experience and lending his support to countless humanitarian efforts. I tell you, I am personally the one who is honored to be on this stage introducing this year's recipient of the Human Security Award. For me, he is the paradigm of that quiet, self-effacing dignity and respect that, in the end, these are what uplift and redeem humankind. He is the global face of something profound, but it's something that every one of us can find inside ourselves if we want to. Please join me in welcoming the 2006 Human Security Award recipient, General and Senator Romeo Dallaire.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you for a few moments this evening. And well done to the recipients of past years and of this year in their research in bringing science and also rigor and discipline to some of the very complex problems that exist around the world, and hopefully bringing innovative solutions to them. Now, I am a retired general and also have been doing a number of lectures, and soldiers are very visual people, so I use every pedagogical tool I can find, and PowerPoint is my strength, and but tonight I'm going to be doing without it, so I hope that you'll be able to visualize what I will be speaking of. What I will be speaking of is a bit of history of the situation in regards to humanity and human rights in the world as complex as it is. Bring you in that history, which is a little farther than CNN history, which is last week. We're going to go a little farther than that. Bring it to today and project you into the future with some ideas or some thoughts on how, in fact, we hope that things will change. Because ultimately, things will change. There is an optimism in all this. There is an optimism based on the fact that we are advancing in regards to humanity and not regressing, as difficult at times that may be to believe. We are advancing because we have articulated human rights, and we have institutions in the world that are pursuing that. And we will ultimately attrit this concept that we seem to have of creating conflict because of the frictions of our differences. And I believe that ultimately we will resolve these differences and we will not revert to conflict because of human rights and the respect of human dignity, and because human beings do not seek conflict, they seek serenity. And in so doing, ultimately, we will achieve that. And this grand movement of human rights is just starting when you look at the length of time that it will require, because I think that ultimately we will eradicate conflict because of the differences amongst human beings, and it'll only take a couple centuries. Only a couple centuries. That's all. In the evolution of humanity, that I believe that the movement of human rights, and through instruments like all the non-government organizations, will actually attrit that concept that exists of using conflict to attempt to solve problems. Now, I will speak to you this evening not in my mother tongue. My mother tongue is Québécois, or as some friends in France would say, 18th century French. And I flew in from Quebec today, and I had the pleasure of having my luggage fall into the Chicago airport mulching machine. And someday it might spit my luggage back out, so I hope you don't mind my dress this evening. In speaking this evening, I will speak in the North American English, which is a mixture of the Webster and Oxford pronunciations, and so I hope that I won't offend too many ears in doing so. And I learned this English in East End, Montreal as a young boy because my mother, who was a Dutch war bride, came to Canada. My father was a soldier at the time, with English, French, German, and Dutch as languages that she had learned in high school, and felt I should learn English. And so the place where I could learn English in East End, Montreal, which was a blue-collar French-Canadian Catholic area, was in this isolated English Protestant school in the midst of all this area, and in particular in the basement of that school on Tuesday nights at a Cub pack, Cubs and Scouts. And so I joined on Tuesday nights. This young French-Canadian Catholic boy would go to this English Protestant school on Tuesday nights, and on Wednesday mornings I'd go to confession. Now, the Sixer who was with me, and the Sixer was an ambitious young guy, and he decided that, caught with this bump on the log, they'd have to do something to win the Akela pennant, for those of you who know the scouting movement. And so to do that, they decided to teach me a rhyme. It's a boy's rhyme of that time. And it doesn't offend, but it goes something like this. When you're out with your honey and your nose is a runny, don't think it's funny, because it's not. Now, most of you picked that up pretty fast. It took me 1.5 years to figure that out. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in a very complex time. We are in a time in which we are now really recognizing as a new era. An era that is significantly different from the previous era. An era that really started with the end of the Cold War, some call it the postmodern era. And so we're talking about the end of the 80s, in 1989 and thereabouts. And in so doing, changed the nature of, in fact, the conflicts and the complexities around humanity and around the world. And we essentially stumbled into the 90s, stumbled into a new era that is still ongoing today, and I would predict is there for a number of decades. Because we entered an era not of world order, as in fact George Bush Sr. stated at the time, but in fact we've entered an era potentially of world disorder. And in that disorder have discovered that the humanity has moved through thresholds unanticipated and in fact unthought of in the past as we lived through that balance that existed in the Cold War. A near comfortable balance, really, when you look at our daily routines of the time and our concerns of security. In those days, we were talking about a very Eurocentric situation of the Western countries and the Eastern countries of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. We talked about sort of the epitome of the classic war scenario in which we'd have millions of people in uniform with billions and billions of dollars worth of equipment, sophisticated weaponry and so on, facing each other across a line in Europe. And that balance underneath a nuclear umbrella was essentially our concern of security. And as long as the diplomats continued to negotiate and we kept that sort of balance between the two elements, we could get on with things. Things were pretty balanced out. We essentially felt a certain level of comfort of having the solution to our security problem. And so we conducted our business as such. That sort of equilibrium that was there permitted us to concentrate on our needs and what we were doing, and essentially kept us in that sort of northern hemisphere perspective of the world. Except that era of equilibrium, this era of classic use of force, this era of the classic diplomats in the counter-stroking of moving within a sort of structured, well-known arena of diplomatic endeavors, took an incredible nosedive with the end of that Cold War era. Because what happened is that the end of the Cold War took away that sort of balance. One, because, in fact, the Cold War was won by the West, but the other one, and the other component that has created so much, it also took away the balance within the rest of the world community. And in particular, in many of the states that we have seen since imploding in interstate conflict, in extremes that we could have never anticipated, in places that we had rarely thought about, let alone studied, or were knowledgeable of the geography, let alone the culture of those countries. And why did that happen? What sort of precipitated this? Well, when you look at the countries that were the colonies of the past, and regions like Africa, amongst others, where so many of those nations, the 53 nations there, got rid of their colonial masters in the late 50s and early 60s, turning to what they thought would be the democratic processes of the time, trying to make nations out of artificial structures, artificial countries that did not respect any tribal or ethnic lines in one way or another, artificial countries created by the colonial powers. Instead of moving into that process of gaining that independence, that rule of law, that good governance process, many of those nations, in fact, found themselves at the hands of dictators and autocrats and demagogues, many of which we or the East put into power. And we did that because we did not want to see the frictions that would be created in those artificial nations actually spill over to involve us, and in so doing find confrontation between the East and the West in countries like Tanzania or the Congo or the such. And so to avoid that, we bought off these dictators and autocrats to keep a grip on the countries. We don't want to be dragged into World War III because of a hassle in some of these countries. And so for nearly 30 years, those countries were held under control of these autocrats. And as an example, in Rwanda, the dictatorship there at first was funded by the Chinese and the Russians, and they built the roads. And subsequently, in the years, it shifted, and the West built, in fact, the soccer stadiums. But essentially, we kept them under wraps. And then in 1989, with the end of the Cold War, we essentially turned to these same countries and we said, listen, we don't really need you anymore. There's no real concern. So why don't you sort yourselves out? And by the by, if you really want us to help you, we want to see democratic processes. We want to see the free elections and the freedom of expression and so on. And we want to see it soon. Because if we don't see that, well, it'll be difficult for us to provide you funds through the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. And so accelerate the creation of these institutions of good governance and rule of law. And in so doing, then we will be able to respond to you. And so what we've seen is so many of those countries imploding because those who were in power were not particularly keen in sharing it, and those who were trying to gain the advancement of their nations in good governance, rule of law, found themselves as moderates, the targets of extremism on a scale not seen before. And so throughout the 90s, and as we moved into the new millennium, so many of these nations imploded, and imploded in catastrophic failure. Now, there were two general sort of trends in that sort of implosion process. You had the humanitarian catastrophe scenario that degenerated into a security situation. Let's use Somalia as the example. Somalia, its system of governance had failed. Drought had created hundreds of thousands of victims. They needed aid and assistance, and we went in 92 and 93, and we provided a whole bunch of aid. But in so doing, the warlords started to maneuver, and in so doing created an insecurity situation that culminated, if you remember, in Mogadishu in October of 93, which became a movie called Black Hawk Down, with the death of 18 U.S. Rangers and 72 others injured. And when that happened, we started a new era in regards to how to respond to catastrophe. A humanitarian catastrophe that degenerated into a security problem, because with those casualties, the United States pulled out and abandoned not only the Pakistanis and other countries and the UN, but abandoned the Somalis. Because the fear of casualties in a country that had absolutely no interest, that is, that had no strategic value, be it its geography or its resources, there was no self-interest in there, was not worthy of spilling blood in those countries, and in so doing, the whole of the Western world became gun-shy on casualties in countries where we were there purely on a humanitarian basis. And in fact, barely 6 months later, at the start of the Rwandan civil war and genocide, other developed countries came in the first days of it to assess the situation. And as one country in particular, the staff officers came to me and said, "General, we're recommending back home that we don't come and support your mission to try to stop this genocide. I mean, there's nothing here. There's no oil, there's no value, the geography. Rwanda's of no consequence. The only thing that's here are humans, and there are too many of them anyways. It's overpopulated." And so commenced this reaction of sort of balancing the value of humanity, of we and they. So a humanitarian catastrophe that degenerated into a security problem was one sort of scenario. The other scenario of the 90s is a scenario in which we have a security situation that degenerates into a humanitarian crisis. Rwanda. Yes, you have a civil war, but you have a peace agreement. The peace agreement calls on all parties to move and advance the peace process with a sort of observer neutral force there as a referee, which is the Blue Beret, the peacekeepers, invented in 1956 by Lester Pearson, who became our prime minister in the Suez crisis. And essentially, the peacekeeper is someone who's there observing and reporting, making sure that both sides play by the rules of the peace agreement. And they're there because both sides want peace. And so the neutral element is there to report if there's some misdemeanors being done, and they work out the details, and essentially both sides want peace. And as we saw the peace agreement being implemented, and really the world not particularly interested in Rwanda at the time, there were already 15 other major missions going on from Cambodia to Yugoslavia to Haiti. Rwanda was not a particular priority. The international community responded at the minimum possible level. And what we saw was essentially a security problem degenerate from a peace agreement to political stagnation, to subversive elements conducting assassinations on moderates, to small-scale massacres, to riots, to more assassinations, larger-scale riots, assassinations that ultimately degenerated into a civil war that then degenerated into a genocide, a security situation that ended up in a humanitarian catastrophe. And so we have, throughout the 90s, and as we move into this new millennium, these sort of scenarios that repeat themselves in these imploding nations around the world. And we find that the tools to help solve them, let alone prevent them, just don't seem to be there. Nor do we see necessarily a consistency in how we respond to these massive human rights abuses. We pour tens of thousands of troops into ex-Yugoslavia. Interestingly, before there was a peace agreement, the UN went into ex-Yugoslavia with 23,000 troops. The situation degenerating, the Americans lead an initiative with Dayton to bring a peace agreement, and with the peace agreement we put 67,000 troops. And as we're pouring thousands of troops into ex-Yugoslavia, Rwanda degenerates into a genocide and everybody pulls out. What were the criteria between the two? What exactly called for us to respond so much to Yugoslavia and yet abandon Rwanda? Abandon Rwanda when in fact there were more people killed, injured, internally displaced, refugeed, and raped in Rwanda in 100 days than in the 6 years of the Yugoslavian campaign. Was it because of the self-interest of Rwanda, a small country in Africa? Was it because the Yugoslavs had been our allies in World War II? We knew them more. Was it because of the security of Europe and the insignificance of Rwanda on the world stage? Was it because one was white and the other was black? What we found throughout the 90s is we established a pecking order in humanity. And in that pecking order, the lowest priority of humanity came out as being the sub-Sahara black African. The last place we'll commit unless there is a self-interest. The last place where we will go and take risks of potential casualties unless there's something there that is worthy of us. And in March of 1994, 3 weeks before the Rwandan genocide, President Clinton approved Proposition Directive number 25 that said we will not go in unless it's in our self-interest, and applied it. And so we have a massive abuse of human rights in front of us on the cameras on a daily basis. And we don't react. We absolutely don't react. We abandon Rwandans. And in fact, the subtitle of my book is The Failure of Humanity in Rwanda, not only within Rwanda, where extremism is now to the extent where they kill their own, they mutilate their own to achieve their aims. But the failure of humanity that is the rest of humanity, the failure of stopping a genocide of 800,000 human beings, of which over 300,000 were children, and the bulk of the killing done with machete by youth between the ages of 16, 17, and 25. At the same time, ABC, CBS, and NBC showed more media coverage on O.J. Simpson's glove and Tanya Harding kneecapping her opposition than on the Rwandan genocide. Why? The media were in the field. I had soldiers risking their lives to get the stories out every day to my headquarters in Uganda that moved it then to Kenya, in fact, to move it then to the great centers of Atlanta and New York and Paris and London and Toronto, so that the stories would be shown. And many of the stories ended up on the cutting floor and not presented on the media. Was there a reason that we didn't want it presented, or was it simply that we were not interested? Why not interested in the catastrophe of humanity, where in fact humans were slaughtering other humans like animals in a deliberate plan? Imagine the extremists are sitting around a table with this peace agreement, which they signed under duress, which essentially demanded that they share power with the other ethnicity and other political groups. They'd been in absolute power for 30 years. Not keen on doing that. They sat around, they said, how do we prevent this from happening? How do we ensure that we don't lose all this power? And they came up with a plan. And the plan was very simple. What we do is we eliminate the opposition. I mean, let's just get rid of them. And they devised a plan to slaughter 1,200,000 Tutsis. Right down to every 10 huts, they had identified them. And they ultimately slaughtered 700,000 of them, plus 100,000 moderate Hutus, and we watched it. We, the international community, to which we are very readily blame the UN for ineffectiveness. And it is true, I made mistakes in my command. It is true, the Secretariat in the United Nations made mistakes in our decisions. Didn't put the priority, it was involved in so many other missions. Didn't have the capabilities. But the real blame for letting that happen, that is to say, not trying to prevent it, but when it was occurring, not trying to stop it. For it is the Rwandans ultimately that stopped it. The real blame comes to the sovereign states that make up the UN. For the UN is nothing without the sovereign states' support. The sovereign states own the troops, own the diplomats, own the resources. The UN is not a state. It's not a government. It's a process. It's a dream trying to be applied, trying to give a reference to the world in regards to the sanctity of humanity, of human rights. And when the sovereign states don't want to give the tools to the UN, even with all its warts and its problems, then the UN becomes ineffective and then also becomes a greatest scapegoat. Hey, how can we do anything? The UN can't sort it. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we entered an era in which we've often abdicated towards humanity. Even though we fundamentally believe in human rights, we believe in humanity and human rights. But is it human rights only for those who can afford it? Can we be bicéphale? Can we actually go absolutely nuts when one of our own is abused by our judicial system or our governmental structures and so on, and argue and fight vehemently for the rights of that individual? And yet in the same newscast, watch tens of thousands being slaughtered 12 hours away by aircraft and say, oh, geez, we can't do much about that. Somebody else should handle it. But the somebody else is us. The somebody else, if it is the UN, is us. It is not a separate entity. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we find ourselves in this era of enormous complexity and ambiguity. Complexity and ambiguity because we believe in some of those fundamental premises, and yet we let these disasters happen, we watch it, and we believe that the price of trying to stop it may be too high. Because we believe that maybe our lives are more important than theirs. In fact, one could easily state that maybe all humans are not human. Maybe some humans actually count more than others. The Belgians lost 10 white soldiers in the first 24 hours. Within 48 hours, they convinced everybody else in the world that we'd all be slaughtered in the mission, and we all pulled out. And we're ordered to pull out. And most of the countries pulled their forces out, except a few Africans who stayed with me. Because our lives were more significant than theirs. And there you have a colonial power, which is part of the source of the friction, that in the face of this calamity abandoned and brought everybody else with them. And so we find the debate then is whether or not we are actually to be held accountable for this international complexity and ambiguity. Can, in fact, we hold the people in the field accountable for what is happening or not happening? Many of the commanders in the field are held far more accountable for bringing everybody home safely than actually saving thousands of lives and ultimately accomplishing the mission with the risks involved. And so we find our aversion to casualties to the extent, whereas in Somalia and in other missions that we see, the commanders are not putting the troops into the harm's way that would be required to protect the hundreds of thousands of people, but in fact holding back. Because ultimately, the measure of success of the mission is on whether or not you had casualties amongst your own versus, in fact, saving the lives of others. We've established this pecking order because we are having a problem in our fundamental beliefs, in our commitments. If we take 10 casualties or 15 casualties, we'll all be pulled out, irrelevant of the impact that that has on the people we're there to help, because it's a humanitarian mission. We will even have people arguing that in a humanitarian mission where there's no self-interest, we are to take no casualties. We do what we can, and if it turns bad, we pull out and we let them go at it. We have decided that we will prioritize humanity in that fashion, because all humans are not human. Some of them are more human than others. And in this scenario in which we find ourselves today, How, in fact, do we respond to the fundamental beliefs that we have of our civil liberties, our human rights, of international conventions, of the laws of armed conflict, of humanitarian law? How can we stand ethically and argue for them while at the same time we permit Darfur to happen? Darfur, 3 years they've been at it. Hundreds of thousands slaughtered, 2.5 million displaced and refugeed with absolutely nothing. I've been there twice. Nothing. Targeted on a daily basis. Women raped as they try to get some wood. Men killed if they try to adventure beyond the limits of some of the refugee camps and IDP camps. And yet we see that and we let it happen. We do not commit. The price is too high. The risks are too high. But in this case, it's not just risks of casualties, it's political risks. I mean, this is complex. You got a nation that's massively abusing the human rights of its own people, doesn't want anybody else to come in, and we negotiate. We discuss. Meanwhile, letting that festering genocide continue and exacerbate itself. So in the face of that sort of quandary that we find in regards to human rights and the application around the world, where are we? What have we actually been able to do since the Rwandan genocide, which proved the failure of the never again concept of post-Holocaust? What did we do? What did we learn in the last 12 years over the bodies of those hundreds of thousands of Rwandans? Will we repeat history? Even when we go to the extent of articulating these massive abuses as genocide. It took 6 weeks for the Security Council to agree that in Rwanda it was a genocide. And it wasn't necessarily the UN that wasn't calling it a genocide, it was the sovereign states that sat there that didn't want to call it a genocide, because the convention calls for a response. And so on the 17th of May, the Security Council agrees to my plan to give me 5,000 troops to be deployed to stop the genocide. Now, only major powers and middle powers, like my country, Germany or Japan, who are middle powers, do we have the capability of sending in the forces with the competency and the technology to be able to stop rapidly such an action? I needed them there within about 10 days. To stop the genocide in its tracks, we already had an estimated 300,000 slaughtered and 1 million internally displaced at that time. The first reinforcements arrived 2 months later. They were from Ethiopia, who had just finished its own civil war. They couldn't even wear the blue beret. They didn't know how to wear it. They came in with nothing. They were a month late. The genocide was over. Another 500,000 were slaughtered and 3 million displaced internally and refugeed. Not one developed country provided one soldier, diplomat, or humanitarian to stop it. Not one. And today in Darfur, the difference is the following, is that today there is a concept available in the UN to be able to react. 4 years ago, the concept of responsibility to protect was brought in. The concept of responsibility to protect essentially says the following. When a country or government is massively abusing its own people or cannot stop the massive abuse of its own people, we, the international community, have a responsibility, not a right, a responsibility to go in and protect. That means that sovereignty is no more an absolute when massive abuse of human rights is in action. And so we have Sudan that refuses a UN force to go in, and it is massively abusing its own people. And what are we doing? We're negotiating. We're discussing. They're dying. There isn't even a contingency plan being prepared to show the Sudanese government that if they don't change their position, we will conduct a protection operation in Sudan. We have not even looked at that contingency plan. Yet the concept of responsibility to protect is one of the 3 reforms that was approved last year in September 2005 by the General Assembly of the UN. There was a list of 101 recommendations for reform of the UN. Only 3 got approved, and one of them was that. And so now we have this hammer on the Security Council. You've got the tool, the concept is there. How to go about it is clear. Why don't we use it? Do we invade Sudan to protect 2.5 million people? Do we take the casualties in doing it? Do we at least plan it? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've had 12 years of debate and discussion and research and all kinds of symposia and writings and so on, and we are faced with a Rwandan genocide version 2 in slow motion, with a concept that is now available to us to stop it, and we're not doing it. And why are we not doing it? And here is the essence of the future. 1, we're not doing it because it's not in our self-interest. The developed countries essentially will not put the political capital on the line if there's no self-interest there. And 2, we don't want the casualties. We cannot sustain the casualties even in those missions. And so we are continuing to barter on the lives of thousands of Darfurians on a daily basis who are dying. And yet, in other places, we are committing ourselves beyond description in bringing, we hope, good governance, rule of law, empowerment of women, education, equal opportunities. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we are in an era in which tools are available. Instruments are there to advance human rights on a scale that can permit us to provide protection and permit nations to advance under the concepts of human rights and of good governance and ultimately democracy. And yet we are proven again to be weak in front of the decision to commit, not only to commit to stop a crisis, but we have not even approached the dimension of how to prevent a crisis. The mission that I had in Rwanda was going to cost just over $200 million. Within the first 3 months of the genocide, in humanitarian aid alone, we spent $3 billion. With all those people dead and dying and an infrastructure destroyed. That is not a good business plan. That is not logical. That is absolutely corrupt in the intellectual debate in regards to humanity. Unless, as I would like to ebb and provide some time for questions, unless you actually believe that all humans are not human. That in fact, some humans count more than others. And if that is the premise in which you objectively look at, then what we are doing is right, picking and choosing. However, if we believe in the essence of what our democracies, our liberal democracies are built on, And if we believe that human rights is for all human beings, then we should believe that all humans are human. And not one of us is more human than the other. And let me end with this short story. What the extremists were doing in Rwanda in order to get supplies is they would put young children, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years old, in the middle of roads on routes that the NGOs would be taking or that we were using to transfer people between the lines. And then the children would stay there because if they didn't, they'd kill them outright. And so the convoys would stop, they would ambush it, they'd kill the people, steal the food and drugs and so on. And so one day I was going between the lines, and up ahead in no man's land there was this little boy, 3, 4 years old, in the middle of the road. And the first instinct was, we might be being set up for an ambush. I had a couple soldiers with me, and so we slowed down, stopped, jumped out, no ambush. So then with this little boy in the middle of no man's land, we went to the huts along the road, yelling and looking for somebody to take care of the child. And all we found were decomposing bodies. The slaughter had happened there at least 4 weeks beforehand. And as we're going through the huts, we lost the child. So we turned around and went back, and we found him in a hut where there were 2 adults, male, female, some children, all in advanced decaying situation. And this kid was just sitting there in the corner as if he was home. And so I picked him up and I brought him to the middle of the road in front of my vehicle, and I looked at him. And his stomach was bloated and he was scarred and he was dirty, he was mangy, rags on and flies all over him. But then I looked into his eyes. And what I saw in his eyes was exactly what I saw in the eyes of my 4-year-old son before I left for Africa. They were the eyes of a human child, and they were exactly the same. All humans are human. Not one of us is more human than the other. Thank you very much.